Hi guys, I'm Tequila Mockingbird and welcome back to The Path of Flame by Yodepalma. Chapter 7, Illusion. Okay, so what is it you wanted to show us? Draco asked impatiently. They'd all returned to school the day before term would start up, and Harry had dragged his friends up to the boys' dorm with some excitement. Pansy was still looking a little nervous, as if she expected a prefect, or Snape, to show up and tell her off for being there. But Harry ignored her as he dug through his trunk. He managed to dig out the invisibility cloak, shaking it out as he spun it around to show them. "It's a cloak," Blaise said, giving Harry a dubious look. "The Gryffindorks are getting to you, Potter. New clothes really aren't that exciting, no matter how nice they are." Harry sighed somewhat dramatically, but instead of explaining, he swung the cloak over his shoulders and twitched it into place. Everyone gasped gratifyingly. "I don't have one of those," Draco said, his voice a jealous whine as he reached out towards Harry's invisible body. "And I don't believe your dad gave you this." "He didn't," Harry said, backing up towards his trunk again. Pansy looked unnerved by Harry's head floating in midair. "He and Ed gave me one of Ed's old alchemy books. I'm to finish it before the summer, but I thought your dad wasn't letting you learn alchemy yet," Blaise interrupted, looking almost as jealous as Draco. "Can I read it?" Draco asked with bright eyes, Pansy nodding along beside him. Harry hesitated uncertainly. "I don't know," he said slowly, frowning back when everyone scowled at him. "I'm not allowed to do any alchemy before Dad teaches me. And he obviously can't teach any of you." "But it's your book now, isn't it?" Pansy whined in a sweet voice that Harry wasn't even remotely fooled by. "Shouldn't you be allowed to do whatever you want with it? Like, say, letting your very good friends and housemates borrow it?" "I'll check with Dad," he replied stubbornly. Uncharacteristically, Blaise didn't start teasing him about this response, and Harry raised an eyebrow at him questioningly. "We saw your dad at the party," Blaise said with a dramatic shiver. "That man is terrifying when he's angry. And honestly, I can't blame you for doing whatever he says." "That's only the second time I've seen him like that," Harry said very quietly, looking between his three friends uncomfortably. "And this time was worse. He thought they'd killed Ed, and, well, it was really bad. But it convinced Dad to propose, so—" "What?" Draco and Pansy interrupted. Pansy had her hands clasped over her chest, her eyes starry in a way that made Harry uncomfortably aware that she was a girl. But Draco was just staring at Harry with a stunned expression. Blaise alone seemed unperturbed. "I thought Ed was wearing a ring under his glove," he said thoughtfully, smirking when Draco and Pansy both turned to him with a surprised look. "Getting engaged makes sense, I guess, but didn't you say he was 19? Seems a bit young." "He'll be 20 next month," Harry protested, then made a face at himself when he realised how ridiculous that sounded, especially knowing that his dad was 33 and had never been married before. In fact, Harry was pretty sure that Ed was the longest relationship his dad had ever had, which was probably why Roy was marrying him. "Dad's always said Ed's really mature, okay? And Ed was really happy about it. I don't think he was expecting it at all." "When's the wedding?" Draco interrupted with a grin. "And can we come? Then we get to go to a mess dress. They can't deny us if we're invited to a wedding, can they?" "I guess I can ask Dad," Harry said slowly, surprised that Draco would want to come. But all three of them were looking at Harry with bright, excited faces. "Don't get your hopes up. There's probably going to be loads of people already. Between military and all of Ed's friends and stuff." "Father would want to come," Draco said enthusiastically. Blaise and Pansy both gave him despairing looks. Neither of their parents were friendly with Roy, though they'd probably all met at the ball. He and Mother were very impressed with his alchemy, and Mother was intrigued by the way Ed fought. He doesn't act like a teacher. Harry shifted uncomfortably, thinking of Ed's time in the military, but didn't say anything. He just took off his cloak. the movement catching Draco's attention again, and the blonde's eyes lit up as something clearly occurred to him. He was just about to speak when the door opened and Harry quickly shoved the cloak out of sight. "What's with the party?" Theodore Knott asked as he stepped into the room, eyeing Pansy suspiciously. "Are you even allowed to be up here?" Pansy paled visibly, but she gave not a haughty look as she replied, "Of course I am not. The boys invited me. But I should leave anyway. We've got class in the morning." "Ugh, don't remind me," Harry groaned, perhaps a little too dramatically. "I am not looking forward to getting back to History of Magic." Pansy made a face in agreement with Harry, and then quickly said her goodbyes before sweeping out the room. Harry and Blaise turned to their trunks once she was gone. Harry with vague thoughts of reading more basic alchemy before he went to sleep, but Draco sidled over. "We should try out the cloak," he said, so quietly even Harry almost didn't hear him. "Tonight. We could go check out the 3rd floor, see why it's closed off." "You're still on about that?" Harry asked just as quietly, but he felt a thrill at Draco's words anyway. It would be his own little adventure, like the story Ed and Al had told him that they'd used to get up to. As long as they didn't get caught, he could always share it with his dad when he got home. Roy would probably give him an exasperated look, but Harry knew he'd be impressed anyway. Finally, he smiled at the hungry gaze Draco was giving him and said, "Yeah, let's do it. Pretend to go to bed and wait for everyone else to fall asleep, though. I don't want Not to know about this." "What are you two whispering about?" Blaise asked, stepping over to them with a suspicious gaze. Harry and Draco shared a look. "Nothing," they chorused. "You're going out with the cloak, aren't you?" Blaise sighed. "No, don't tell me. You two are crazy, and I want no part in your certain deaths." "We should have invited Pansy," Harry whispered to Draco as they were leaving the dormitory later that night. "No way she'd want to come," Draco protested with a shake of his head. "She doesn't have an adventurous bone in her body. She'd probably just try to make us stop." "Don't tell me she'd be worried we were going to get into trouble," Harry said disbelievingly. "No, but she believes Dumbledore when he says we'll die if we went there," Draco said with a snort. "Like the headmaster would ever be that careless." "I don't know," Harry said slowly. Draco poked him when he didn't continue immediately, and Harry sighed. "Just, if he is keeping whatever was in Gringotts in the school, it makes sense that he'd have some sort of dangerous protection on it, wouldn't it?" "Having second thoughts?" Draco asked, and Harry grinned at him, even though his friend couldn't see it. "Nah, it's not an adventure without danger. Even Al says that." "Now be quiet. We don't want to get caught." Draco made an annoyed sound, but otherwise kept his mouth shut as Harry had sort of ordered. They made a rather halting progress through the hallways, both of them wary of crossing any of the teachers, or even worse, Filch. The castle was much more eerie at night, with the moonlight streaming in through the arrow slits, making the shadows dance in their peripheral vision. They jumped at every little noise, and once the wind had screamed particularly loudly, Draco had grabbed the back of Harry's shirt, trembling. "Do you want to go back?" Harry whispered, more concerned about his friend than the adventure. "Not on your life," Draco said insistently. Harry pretended not to notice the shake in his voice. "We're almost there." Which was true enough, Harry supposed, so he continued shuffling along. Soon they were at the door to the 3rd floor corridor, and they gave each other excited grins before Harry reached for the door, which didn't open. "Oh, come on!" Draco huffed in disappointment. "We came all the way out here for nothing." Harry hesitated, feeling as disappointed as he thought Draco did, and eventually said, "Dad taught me a spell to open locks. He wasn't supposed to use it except in emergencies." His dad had muttered something about nosy busybodies when Harry had asked. So he kind of didn't really want to use it to sneak somewhere he knew he shouldn't be. But Draco had gotten him so excited about this adventure, and it would really be more upsetting to have to return without a story. "Well," Draco interrupted his thoughts impatiently, "what are you waiting for? Use it!" "It might not work," Harry warned him, but he took a deep breath anyway, then pointed his wand at the lock and said, "Alohomora." Harry didn't get to celebrate his victory as the door swung open. He felt something brush against the back of his legs, followed by a soft meow. "Mrs. Norris!" Draco gasped, and gave Harry a sharp shove. They pushed into the room with more haste than was probably wise, considering the warning they were given about this floor, and once the door was closed again, they both turned to push their ears up against it. Filch appeared with unsurprising speed, panting heavily as he spoke to his cat, in a quiet tone that they couldn't quite make out. Harry held his breath until the voice faded away, and then let out a sigh and thunked his head on the door very softly. "Thank Merlin he thinks this door is locked," Draco whispered as he turned around. "Now, let's see—" Harry felt Draco go stiff with horror, and he sighed unhappily before turning him around himself. He was expecting to see Snape, or maybe Dumbledore, and was preparing himself for punishment when he caught sight of what was actually there. His eyes fell first on what was clearly a trapdoor and humongous paws standing over it. His mouth dropped in horror as he followed the length of the leg until he found himself staring straight into the eyes of a massive, three-headed dog, straight from Hades itself. He was never going to forgive himself for the high-pitched squeaking sound he made, but resolved to think about that later. For now, he fumbled behind him for the door handle, terrified as the dog bared its teeth and started to growl at them. "Harry!" Draco said tightly when the dog's feet shifted, a bare second before Harry's finger found the latch, and he shoved the door open. He grabbed the back of Draco's shirt as he fell backwards through the door, and then slammed the door behind them with an unwisely loud noise and took off running in the opposite direction of the door. Filch would be better than getting eaten by that thing. Heck, he'd rather even face down Hawkeye. But, only just. Eventually they ducked out of an unfamiliar secret passageway and came to an unsteady halt next to a silent suit of armour. Draco had left the confines of the invisibility cloak at some point in their mad dash, and Harry was just pulling him back under it when they heard a voice. "You asked me to come directly to you, Professor, if anyone was wandering around at night. And somebody's been on the 3rd floor." Filch's voice murmured quietly from the next corridor over. And then, to their horror, the voice that answered was the one they both knew very well, Professor Snape. "The forbidden corridor?" he asked in a tone Harry felt was more suspicious than warranted. "Hurry then, maybe we can catch them before they get too far." Draco managed to get himself under the cloak just before Filch and Snape turned the corner onto their corridor. Unfortunately, the hallway they were in was barely wide enough to let two people walk abreast, and Harry backed into Draco as he tried to flatten himself against the wall. He stood paralysed for a brief moment, watching them come closer, until he noticed Draco was tugging urgently on his arm. He looked to his left, the direction Draco was pulling in, and noticed a door that was slightly ajar. As silently and as quickly as possible, he ducked into the room with Draco on his heels. They didn't take off the cloak as they listened to the two adults walk swiftly past them, and it was almost a full minute before Harry felt like he could breathe normally again. "Hey, what's that?" Draco asked, ducking out from underneath the cloak. Harry sighed and followed him over to what appeared to be an old mirror propped up against the wall. Curiosity piqued, he admired the ornate golden frame. "What does this mean?" he asked eventually, pointing at an inscription on the top of the frame. Draco's brow furrowed as he stared at it, and slowly mouthed the words to himself. Eventually he shrugged at Harry, clearly at as much of a loss as he was. "Hey, are we invisible in mirrors too?" Draco asked instead, getting back under the cloak and dragging Harry over. They positioned themselves in front of the mirror with some jostling as Draco tried to get in front of Harry. They finally looked up at the mirror. Harry fully expected not to see anything except the shadows of the room, or maybe Draco's head peering over his shoulder, if the mirror could see through the cloak, and gasped aloud when he saw something else entirely. Draco was nowhere to be found, but arrayed behind Harry in two distinct groups were a surprising amount of people. The only reason he didn't look behind him was that he immediately recognised Roy and Ed standing there on his left shoulder at the front. in front of his diverse family from Amestris. He didn't recognise the people on his right. Who are they? Harry asked in wonder, taking a step closer to the mirror. Who are who? Draco asked, and there was a distinct tone of displeasure in his voice. Harry turned to him curiously and took in his friend's sneer, then turned back to the mirror in confusion. His view hadn't changed. All I see is myself. A bit older, but I look like... Like who? Harry asked vaguely as he peered up into the red-haired woman's eyes. It took him a moment to realise they were the same shade as his own, and he forgot all about Draco as he realised. Mum? What? Draco asked sharply. Harry felt him tugging at his elbow again, but waved him off as he turned his attention to the tall man, with his arm around the woman's shoulder. His messy hair looked as untamable as Harry's own, and he knew this must be his father. His real father. Not that Roy wasn't his dad, of course, but there was something captivating about finally being able to see the people who had given birth to him. Harry, we should go. Draco's urgent voice brought him back to his senses, and he tore his gaze from the mirror and nodded jerkily at him, but Draco still had to pull him out of the room. Don't go back again, Draco said darkly the next morning, stabbing his breakfast viciously. Harry, who had only been poking at his own as he gazed off into space, jumped in his seat before turning to his friend with a confused frown. I'm serious. I've got a bad feeling about that thing. Harry stared at him for a long moment. You want me not to go back because you had a bad feeling? He asked. Draco scowled at him and nodded. You're just sore because you didn't like what you saw in it. I am not, Draco snapped. Harry snorted and turned back to his breakfast. So Draco continued sourly. Fine, do what you want. I hope Snape catches you. Harry was distracted through all of his classes that day, lost in thoughts of the family he'd never known. Wouldn't it have been great if he could have both of his families mingling together? Maybe even living in one large mansion, like the Malfoys owned. He could go to English Christmas parties when his dad was at the Furious Solstice Ball. And whenever his dad had to send Harry away for his own safety, he could return to England instead. Or maybe his parents could have been convinced to move to Amestris. Of course, that would never happen. He was old enough to know that he wouldn't have Roy if his parents were still alive. But he'd never even so much as seen a picture of his parents before. So that night he waited until everyone in his dorm had gone to sleep before he slid out of his own bed and made his way back to the mirror room. Back again, Harry? A voice asked some time after he'd sat contentedly on the floor in front of the mirror. Something heavy landed in Harry's stomach, and he turned to see the headmaster himself sitting on one of the unused desks in the room. Had Harry actually been so lost in thought he'd walked straight by the man? I didn't see you, sir, Harry stammered, getting to his feet. Strange how nearsighted being invisible can make you, Dumbledore said with a smile. Wasn't he mad about Harry breaking rules? So, you, like hundreds before you, have discovered the delights of the Mirror of Erised. Was that what it was called? It seemed like a strange name. But then he remembered the inscription on the top of the mirror and figured that nobody else had been able to decipher it either. I expect you realise what it does? Dumbledore asked. Well, it showed me my family, Harry responded uncertainly, trailing off as he considered the implications. He still didn't know exactly what Draco had seen in the mirror to make him so displeased with it, but he knew what it had shown for him. It shows us what we want? Or the results of us getting what we want? Dumbledore's eyes raised in surprise at Harry's answer, but the headmaster didn't say what about it had been strange. Instead, he said in a quiet voice, Yes and no. It shows us nothing more or less than the deepest, most desperate desires of our heart. You who have never known your real family, see them standing around you. However, this mirror will give us neither knowledge nor truth.
Men have wasted away before it, enchanted by what they have seen, or been driven mad, not knowing if what it shows is real, or even possible.
But it obviously can't be possible, Harry said, turning back to look at his mum again. My family's dead, and... He stopped abruptly, realising suddenly that Dumbledore hadn't mentioned the Emestrians. He had said that Harry saw his real family, obviously referring to his blood family. So maybe he couldn't see what was in the mirror for Harry as he'd thought. Biting his lip, he didn't finish the rest of his sentence, as he and Dumbledore stared at each other for a brief moment, until the headmaster started talking again.
The mirror will be moved to a new home tomorrow, Harry, and I ask for you not to go looking for it again. If you ever do run across it again, you will now be prepared. It does not do well to dwell on dreams and forget to live. Remember that. Now, why don't you put on that admirable cloak and get back on off to bed?
Harry hesitated for a brief moment, wondering what Dumbledore saw in the mirror, but decided not to ask. If Draco wouldn't even tell him what he'd seen, why would the headmaster answer his questions? So Harry just gave the old man a shaky smile before swinging the cloak back over his shoulders and quietly making his way back to the Slytherin dorms. Time at the school seemed to slow down considerably after that. Harry spent long hours in the library with Hermione and Neville, unhappily studying as the teachers piled more and more work onto them. The spring holidays weren't very fun at all. Mostly everyone stayed at the castle for them, probably in an attempt to remind themselves to keep up with their work. On a particularly nice day over break, Harry walked into the library later than usual with Draco trailing behind him, only to find Hermione and Neville huddled together and whispering to each other. Neither of them were actually paying attention to their books, which was practically unheard of for the studious Gryffindor girl, so Harry sauntered over to them as quietly as possible. "So, what's the secret?" he asked, and Harry gave an awful little screech as she spun round to stare at him. Neville jumped and nearly fell off his chair, staring up at Harry with a hand over his heart. Harry grinned at them. "Harry, don't scare us like that," Hermione said shrilly. She must have received a glare from Madame Pince at the pitch of her voice, because she winced and continued to soften her tone. "There's no secret. Why would you think that?" "Granger, the only way you could have been more suspicious is if you were wearing a hooded cloak and slinking around in a dark corner," Draco drawled in his most annoying voice, smirking when Hermione glared at him. "You might as well tell us what's going on." Hermione turned back to Neville, and the two of them shared a long look. Harry only had a moment to wonder when the two of them had become such close friends that they could communicate without talking, when Hermione turned back to Harry with a huff. "You should come meet Hagrid with us," she said in a bright, excited voice, though she was ignoring Draco entirely. "I know you'll like him." "Isn't he the gamekeeper?" Harry asked, confused. Hermione blushed lightly and gave Harry an awkward shrug. Harry figured she must have met him some time before Halloween. "I mean, sure, I'll go along if you want." "Really, Potter?" Draco asked in disbelief as Hermione beamed at him. "You don't have to come, Malfoy," Hermione said snidely, arching a brow at the blonde. It only proved that she didn't know Draco at all. "Of course I'm going to come," Draco said, acting surprised that Hermione thought he wouldn't. Harry snorted and rolled his eyes. "I wouldn't miss this for anything." Hermione made an unhappy noise, but seemed to decide that there was nothing she could do about Draco coming along, as she gave one last look to Neville before turning back to the table. Draco rolled his eyes at Harry before he moved into his customary chair at the other end of the table, and silence fell on the group as they all began studying. They met up in front of the doors an hour later, and Hermione filled them in on what Hagrid was like as they walked across the grounds. Apparently he was really nice and had befriended Hermione long before anyone else, when he'd realised that she'd always been alone. Hermione visited whenever she wanted advice or a shoulder to cry on. Hagrid, in turn, told her all about all different kinds of vicious beasts he'd taken care of in some point of life or another. "Do you think he knows that dog?" Draco asked Harry in a carrying whisper. Hermione shot him a curious look, but apparently thought better of asking about it, and Harry just shrugged. "We can ask him about him," Harry said much more discreetly. "But if he likes horrible animals as much as Hermione's saying, I wouldn't be surprised." As they approached the cabin on the edge of the grounds, Harry was surprised that all the curtains were closed. He wondered if maybe the man wasn't home, but Hermione knocked on the door and a suspicious voice asked, "Who is it?" "It's Hermione and Neville," Hermione called back, looking confused. "And I've brought a couple more friends to meet you." The door opened a crack and a large face peered out at them. He looked surprised to see Harry and Draco, and hesitated for a long minute before he finally let them all in and quickly shut the door behind him. Harry wrinkled his nose at the heat inside the little hut, eyeing the fire unhappily. He wouldn't have minded it so much, even on this warm of a day, but Hagrid also had all the windows shut, and no cooling air was moving inside the tiny room.
"So, who have you brought me this time?"
Hagrid asked, ushering them over to the table and offering them some tea and stoat sandwiches. He didn't seem too upset when nobody accepted a sandwich. "This is Harry Potter and Draco Malfoy," Hermione said cheerfully, and didn't seem to notice Hagrid's surprised look.
"You'd be Lucius's son, then?"
Hagrid asked Draco, frowning a little bit when Draco nodded at him. He didn't say anything further, though possibly it's because he had nothing good to say. Instead, he turned to Harry and smiled.
"And of course I know who you are. Spent half my life chasing your dad away from the Forbidden Forest."
Harry almost dropped his teacup. "You knew my parents?"
"Sure did," Hagrid replied kindly. "Your dad and his friends were right troublemakers, but brilliant wizards. And your mum was a great witch herself, too."
"Could you tell me about them sometime?" Harry asked shyly. "I've never met anybody who knew them before."
"Course I can,"
Hagrid replied, his eyes crinkled in a sympathetic smile.
"Just send me an owl whenever you want to meet, and I'll let you know if I can."
"Thanks."
"So, did you want to ask me something?"
Hagrid asked, turning back to Hermione. Hermione and Neville shared another long look, but eventually both shook their heads. "I have a question," Draco spoke up, putting down his own teacup with a loud clink. "Granger says you're really interested in dangerous animals. I was wondering if you knew anything about that three-headed dog in the locked corridor."
"How do you know about Fluffy?"
Hagrid asked in astonishment, nearly breaking his own teacup. "Fluffy?" Harry asked.
"Yeah,
"He's mine," Hagrid replied hesitantly. "Bought him off a Greek chappie in the pub last year. Lent him to Dumbledore to guard the—" "Guard the what?" Harry asked eagerly, leaning forward.
"Never you mind that," Hagrid finished gruffly. "That's dangerous business, and it's best left between Dumbledore and Nicholas Flamel."
"Who's Nicholas Flamel?" Neville asked curiously, but Hagrid, looking furious with himself, didn't answer. Harry sighed unhappily at the ensuing silence, then finally asked, "Do you think we could open a window? It's boiling in here."
"Can't. Sorry, Harry,"
Hagrid replied with a nervous glance at the fire. Harry followed his gaze, and all thoughts of the third-floor corridor vanished from his mind. Sitting in the middle of the fire was a huge black egg that Harry was sure he'd seen in a textbook before. "Is that a dragon egg?" Draco asked, his eyes gleaming with interest as he walked over to it and knelt in front of the fire. "How on earth did you manage to get one of these? They cost a fortune."
"Won it," Hagrid said. "Last night I went down to the village having a few drinks and got in a game of cards with a stranger. Think he were glad to get rid of it, to be honest."
"But what are you going to do with it when it hatches?" Hermione asked.
"Well, I've been doing some reading," Hagrid replied, showing them the large book he pulled from underneath his pillow. "Got this out of the library. Dragon breeding for pleasure and profit. It's a bit out of date, of course, but
It's all we have. It's all we keep here. Keep the egg in the fire, 'cause the mothers breathe on 'em, you see. And when it hatches, feed 'em a bucket of brandy mixed with chicken blood every half hour. And see here how to recognise different eggs. What I got there's a Norwegian Ridgeback. They're rare, them. He looked very pleased with himself, though Hermione didn't. Hagrid, you live in a wooden house, she said. But Hagrid clearly wasn't listening. He was humming quite cheerfully as he stoked the fire, with Draco hovering over his shoulder. So that was Chapter 7 of The Path of Flame by Yodepalma. I've been Tequila Mockingbird, and I hope you join me again next time for Chapter 8, Lasting Impressions.